One of these days he's going to grow up. Good morning. How are you? Still walking around?
I was bragging to you either listen, Thursday was my last PT day. So this was Thursday, we had graduated. You know, and the place is clean, I saw him carrying this before. I'm not gonna stop.
Some sort of antiseptic.
Yeah, because they are constantly. Oh, yeah.
Have you clicked through your presentation to make sure? If he clicks, will it change on the live stream? But don't worry about it. I don't think you're going to. I just went to up to the slide for the next. Yes. Definitely. You can click.
I can live without it. So
That's what you're supposed to do.
Yes.
It's supposed to be a decision made.
No, my notes.
Yeah, if your iPad's up, you move up.
I'm logging on your things for 50 days. I always have backup. So it's either always email to myself, so if I'm home, I have one.
Always plan B.
Have it everywhere.
Hi guys. What game is playing there? Just kidding. Something different. There is, which is Cordelia's and Sandy's from the news house. This house from the news. So these are 10,000. Lots of things to do. Different ones, exciting. A month and a half, 2 months, and then you go, okay, what's the next one?
Got injected by voltage. Then he came off the side. That's such a big deal. Yeah, finished that. And the whole team down.
Melanie is getting tested for allergies, so she's not been able to take her medicine. And
But he was over, he's also in charge of assault, so.
starting tomorrow, we're not sure we tested.
Hey, Preston!
Yeah. What, when are they heading? Florida? Oh, near. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sold out as soon as they go for sale. If I wanted one now, I'd pay $1,500. It over double. It's I just want to get something.
So you're. Nice space. It's very nice though, because you know, there's maybe, you know, I was telling Karen, everybody's saying, what about, it's not that. Lucky, so,
We're talking about something.
Yes.
And so we've got this, and, you know, we didn't have stuff apart because we just thought it was one of the church. So he, he's put it back, the car is this. You will. Karen, have you seen the picture of the Virgil and Raymond? You know, so cute. Is it on Facebook or is it? It's just children. Where did you see this?
Yeah, it is.
That's what I want to hear.
We got very much around with little kids. Yeah, we would buy that.
I don't blame her.
Good morning, y'all. So if you didn't see in the back, there's a booklet that's back there that looks like this. This is half of our class. And so the whole thing, I did a lot of typing. The whole thing is 60 pages, but this is only about 30 or so. This has got the first 7 lessons in here. Mark printed all this out and then Sandy stapled it for us and made a pretty little booklet. So if you don't have one of these, it's got all the lessons. So if you read through here, then you'll see all the notes that I'll be using. But what I want to point out to you guys is in here, there's the pages of questions like this. These are not questions that I'm going to come and say, let me see your questions and what kind of answers do you have. But these are the thought questions that we're going to use as we go through our study of James. And I think that I hope you agree with me when we're done with James, but it's one of the most practical books that you can possibly deal with. And then, so for those of you who are parents or grandparents of high schoolers or the young adults, I taught this class to them last quarter. And so I just taught James to them, so it's still fresh on my mind. And then we're going to do it here with us. So if you would, join me in prayer before we start our class, and then we're going to dive in and talk about the book of James. Father in heaven, we come to you this morning. We're so thankful for this day that you've given us. We're thankful that you bless us the way that you do. We're thankful that we can come together this morning to remember your Son and his sacrifice for us, and know that because of his sacrifice, we have the hope to be with you someday in heaven. We pray that you would be with us this morning as we start this study in the book of James, and that we pay attention to these practical applications that we can make in this book. It's such a great book for us to be able to study and apply the things to our lives. And pray that you would just be with us as we go through this study, and that you would just guide us and direct us through that. Pray that you would be with the rest of the classes this morning as they study about you and they study about your word and about your laws, that you be with all the teachers and all the students, and that much good would come from the study of your word. We love you and pray that you'd always be with us. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, so here's my question to start the morning, and I think this is important. If you ask your kids, first off, how many of you have kids? A lot of us, right? If you ask your kids to do something, what is the question they ask? Why? Why? Has anybody ever heard that? Hey, Dallas, go wash the dishes. Why? Hey, go clean your room. Why? Nobody sees it but me. Hey, do this, do that. And so it's funny how your study evolves as you go through studying, different books or whatever. But the one thing in this book, I want to show you the why before we discuss everything else that we see in the book of James. And so I want our thoughts as we study this quarter to revolve around the why. Why do we do the things that we see in James? Why do we make these practical applications? And the why is James chapter 5, starting in verse 19. The very last two verses of James is the why. It says this: My brethren, if any among you strays from the truth, and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. Our last class in our study of James will focus on this why. But is there anything more important for us as Christians than helping those who may stray from the truth to come back? Is there anything more important than that? I don't think there's anything that's any more important than that. And so the things that we're going to look at in this book are going to help us to get there. We'll see the practical ways that we get there. We're going to talk about relationships, and we're going to talk about our relationships with each other and with God. So, James, what's different about the book of James and who it was written to? Who knows? What's that? Individuals versus churches. So that's a great point, but why is that important? Why is it important for us to look at James and say, wow, this is written to individual Christians versus churches, because the books to churches are important, right? But why is this so important for us to consider how this is written to individuals?
It's the practical side of how we should conduct ourselves.
The practical side about how we should conduct ourselves. And so, can we get good information, good practical information from studying Romans? Yeah, we can. Can we get good practical information from studying Colossians and Philippians and all that great information? But James, when I look at James and I look how it's written to individuals, I can put myself in their shoes. And I can say, aha, I see how this is written. So 5 chapters in this book. James identifies himself in verse 1 like this. He says, James, a bondservant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. So a great introduction. So he says he's a bondservant. What does that mean when he says he's a bondservant of God? Okay, bondservant. Okay, slave of God. And so Megan made a point, and so Megan and Tyler were in the class the last time, and I told you I wrote it in my Bible, and it's still here. And so this is how she described James 1 and verse 1. And so I'll always keep this written here. She says, I am yours, and I have chosen to stay. And so James has chosen to serve God and to stay and to be that person that God would have him to be. It's huge. That kind of attitude. So here's the question, the overriding question for me is, do we do that? Do we choose to stay and serve God? And I hope the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, as we dig into this book, we're going to see lots and lots of ways that we can serve God. Lots of ways that we can be great examples to other people, to do the things that he would have us to do. We're going to see lots of themes. I need to catch up on my PowerPoint, I think. Hold on. I do have a PowerPoint. Let's see. Got that far. Written to individual Christians. All right. So we're going to look at themes in the book of James now that I'm caught up in my PowerPoint. The PowerPoint actually is 110 slides. Can you guys believe that? 110 slides. It's a lot of PowerPoint. Themes in the book of James. Trials. Several themes that we're going to see. So in James chapter 1 and verse 2, he says this, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Testing of your faith. Trials. Who likes a test? Anybody like a test?
Those who are very well prepared.
Okay.
Don't mind that.
Those that's we're going to get to that. That's a good point. Those who are very well prepared. And so sometimes my kids are very well prepared for tests. So you get like these emails from the school. I guess a lot of you probably get these emails. Judy, you get emails from the school, but she does. She emails herself. You get these emails that say, Amy made a 90-something on whatever test. And so they have all these grades. Every once in a while, you're like, oh, you weren't quite ready for that quiz, though, were you? That the teacher popped in and said, hey, y'all, guess what? We're having a quiz. And so we think about trials. And we think about trials in our spiritual life. And so it's huge for us to consider this. But why would James say it's a joy to be tried or to have a test? Do you think it's fun to have a test? Jack, what do you think? Is it fun to test? Okay. How about a trial? Do you think it would be fun to have a trial? Because it seems a little different, right, when you think test versus trial. We are. We are.
Trial is a little bit different than test. It is a test, but it's.
And James says what about that? He says, consider it what? Joy. But why would, Gus, why would James say it's joyful for me to have a trial?
Hopefully, you look at that as building block. And just further proof that possibly you're on the right track or you need to change track.
That's a great point, y'all. If y'all didn't hear it, he says it's a building block, and it helps you know whether you're on the right track or whether you need to change tracks. And so when we consider that's a huge thing for us. So I think a lot of us would look at trials ourselves and say, I'm not really looking forward to whatever it may be, whatever that particular trial may be. We like to take the easy road. And so I go back to running analogies a lot. I ran a half marathon a few years ago, and I'm loved it. Absolutely loved it. I love to run. But there are people that I've talked to about it. They're like, I could never go out and run, 13 miles. But some of those same folks that actually go out and put in the work and do that thing, that half marathon, what do they feel like after it's over with? Accomplished, right? Sense of accomplishment. What they thought that. And so I want you to think about this spiritually. Are spiritual trials hard? Yes. But what about when you overcome them? What does that do to your mindset? We're going to talk about that in this book of James. How you can take the easy road, but when your faith is tested, how you should say, wow, we made it through that. And now that have that roadmap, you know how to keep going. You ever heard the phrase, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger? And we've heard it, right? Is it true? Sometimes, but I'll tell you what is true. And so a lot of you guys know this, and my OCD personality, how I always put my pen in the very middle page of my Bible, 538 and 539. And you guys remember which verse is here? Because I've talked about this in Bible classes before. It is Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 17. It's about halfway between on these two pages, and it says this: iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Iron is sharpened by what? Other iron. Trials, right? Trials. How do you overcome these things that we see? And so this is one of the themes that we're going to talk about in James. And next week, when we really, really dig into chapter 1, we're going to talk about how when your faith is tested and you come out on the other side, you're invariably stronger from that faith test. You understand how to handle situations and how to gain confidence as a result. So here's my question for you, and this is open to the group. Why is it hard for us to be joyous when our faith is tested? Why is it hard? Miss Laverne, why is it hard for us to be joyful when our faith is tested? It's tough, right? Glenn, what do you think? Why is it tough for us to be joyful when our faith is tested?
Well, number one, you survived it. And number two, you know how to deal with it the next time.
Okay. Miss Laverne?
My problem is I have trouble figuring out that it's a test.
Okay. But why is it tough for us to be joyful?
We're fearful.
Okay. We're fearful, right?
We're human. We live in the moment, even though we shouldn't.
Okay.
So have this tendency to live in the moment, dread what's coming.
Yeah. Anybody ever, and that's a good point that James makes. Does anybody ever dread what's coming? Yeah, you dread what's coming, right? And so we a lot of times dread what's coming. We're fearful. Yes, sir.
Even when we feel we're prepared, or even when we know we're prepared, just the anxiety that builds up, knowing that it's ahead of us. But I think God built into us that feeling for good reason. It's that type of flight, type of faith which you're ready to jump one way or another. I think that maybe it's good for us to have that teeny taste in our tongue, anticipating what may or may not happen. Sometimes in the
Great point. That's a great point, all those. And so that brings us to this next, and what I would call the central theme of the book of James. And so as you look at the 5 chapters, the different themes that we'll see, you'll see trials here, and you'll see another theme here. But this one, faith that works, you'll see parts of this in all 5 chapters. All 5 chapters of the book of James. So I would say this would be the overriding theme. And so if I were to look at you and say, what is faith that works? Linda, what would you say for yourself? If you were going to define faith that works, what would you say it was?
Faith that helps us be successful and overcome.
Okay. Faith that helps us to be successful and overcome difficulties. Shane, what about you? What would you say? Faith that works. Faith that brings us to action. And so, Ms. Laverne?
To me, faith that works is faith that God will make sure that we do the right thing if we ask Him.
Okay, God will make sure that we do the right thing if we ask Him. And so what I look at when I see this, I think it's faith that's so strong in God that you can't do anything else but serve Him. Your faith is so strong in the things that He says the things that He promises us and the things that He says are true. Your faith is so strong in that you can't do anything else but do what He wants from you and what He would have you to do.
That statement makes me think of Daniel. Even as a young man, he had to obey God. As an old man, praying where others should see him. He had to do it because that was his faith and belief and obedience to God.
Right. And so that's funny you mentioned Daniel, because Jeremy and I were talking about this the other day, how, that we're talking about James. And for those of you who don't know, Jeremy, that guy, he's done a lot of good study. And he has grown spiritually a lot. And he says, this James, he says, I can see Daniel. And so he makes that correlation. I think that's a good point. And so the correlation that I made was Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 20, the prophet says, I've become a laughing stock to the people. Now, somebody remind me, what was Jeremiah talking to the people about? What's that? Repenting, turning back to God, would you say? Same thing she said. And so he is preaching this message. And in chapter 20, he says, what? I've become a laughing stock. Why? Why do you think he became what he would call a laughing stock? Okay.
People see, a lot of people that see our moral life laugh at us because we're missing out.
Right.
And a lot of people don't even believe in God anymore. So they laugh at us because we believe in God and we believe in obedience to that God. And so we're making a laughing stock like Jeremiah because people don't want to believe it. They want to go on doing exactly what they want to do.
Right. Glenn?
I think it's that, and it's also that traditional Jewish belief that if you're doing well and things are going okay, you're pleasing God. And if you're having problems, it's because you're not pleasing God. And these people were getting a message from the prophet saying, you're not pleasing God, and bad things are coming, but
Right.
They weren't there yet.
And so did that cause Jeremiah to stop? Did that cause Jeremiah to stop? Let's go over there and take a look real quick. Count it all joy. I want to look at this real quick because I love to turn over here to Jeremiah chapter 20 and verse 9. After we see this, what we've been talking about here, verse 9, he says, "But if I say I will not remember him or speak any more in his name, then in my heart it becomes like a burning fire, shut up in my bones, and I'm weary of holding it in, and I cannot endure it." Jeremiah had faith that the things that he was saying were true. And what did he do about it? Even though he was a laughingstock to the people, he said it anyway. And so that's what I'm talking about when we talk about faith that works. If your faith in God and his promises are so strong that you believe them as much as Jeremiah believed the things that he was saying, then can you do anything else except serve God if your faith is that strong? And so that's one of the points that we're going to get to in the book of James as we look at it. Faith so strong that you can't do anything else. Back over in James, down in that chapter, in verse 22, James chapter 1, verse 22, he says this, "But prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves." So the difference. What is the difference between being a hearer of the word and a doer of the word? Difference between those two.
Well, it's like, we can be maybe out of the corner, there's a worker doing their job, and we're watching the work. That's okay, it's entertaining, we can see that something is being accomplished. But the thing is, it's not something that's being accomplished by us, we're just seeing it. We can hear God's word, but if we don't do anything about putting it into action, it's not us doing something that God wants us to do. He doesn't want us to just be hearers, but after hearing it, there's got to be a verb in there somewhere.
Right?
Do it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Not only hear it, but there has to be a verb in there somewhere to do something. James?
The big difference between hearing and doing is understanding, comprehending the word. Because if you hear the word and you understand it, then you're compelled to do it.
Right. Do you guys all know people in your lives who know the Bible inside and out and do nothing about it? I'm sure all of us have met people like that and known folks that they can quote scripture, but their lives say something different. And so here's the question. My question is, what things prevent us from letting faith work in our lives? What things prevent us from being not merely hearers of the word, but doers of the word? What do you guys think?
Looking back at maybe the film of life.
Okay?
We shouldn't dwell on that which was. We forget to dwell on things that are in front of us right now, and we go into our spiritual life.
Right. It's important for us to look forward, right? Now, do we all remember some of the things that we did? Like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have did that. But what does God look at? Should we allow that to affect our service to him? We shouldn't, right? We shouldn't. What other kinds of things prevent us from allowing faith to work in our lives? Ms. Laverne? I want and I want. And so I've said this before. We live in what I would say is a me-driven society, right? I want what I want, and when do I want it? Right now. Right now. Not 5 minutes from now. I want it right now. And so that's a big deal for us. So that's one of those themes that we'll see in this book, but we'll see it, right, Tyler? Over and over in this book, we'll see faith that works. And it was an important point for us to make to those guys in the class, right? How did you think that particular point went when we talked to the class back there?
I hope that they received it well. Something even as, I think we all agree as adults, something we can never lose sight of it, because it's not something you only deal with in really young youth or early youth or middle age, later age. It's a continual thing throughout our entire life that we have to be willing and able to do. We're going to have our moments where we might do less, but then we need to refill ourselves and do more.
You know, he makes a good point that I don't know if you guys heard it. He said it's a continual thing. So when does your service to God stop? It doesn't when you're dead, when you're not able anymore. And so a lot of times, very practical classes like this, I like to teach them to the high schoolers and the college kids, right? So, you know, you kind of, you whet their appetite for serving and seeing how important it is. But I also like to teach it to classes like this. Because when you're 46 or you're 22 or you're 75 or you're 85 or you're 92, you still should be serving. Who remembers Avery Smith that sat right up here in the front? And so what would Avery do after Bible class? For those of you who taught a Bible class that Avery attended, he would talk about it. And so you'd come over and you'd say good morning to him, and then he would say good morning to you, and then he says, hey, what you said about this and this and this, I read and I studied this and this and this. And how old was Avery? In his 90s, right? And he was still doing that, and I remember that, and I would point that out to the kids all the time. He never quit. He never quit. And that's what I'm going to stress in this book when we talk about faith that works, that we never quit.
Because our wants and trials are different. I mean, when I was 17, my wants were very different than what my wants or trials are today.
Right. Yeah, your wants and your trials change, right? They change as you grow and as you get older. Things change. Things change. James spends a significant amount of time talking about trials and testing of our faith and how we can be tried in different ways. One of the things a couple of things that I want to point out before we move on from this is James chapter 4 and verse 7. He says this, submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Where is one place that our trials come from? The devil. The other can be ourself. James chapter 3 and verse 5, he says, so also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And so when we talk about trials that happen, Satan tries us. And then we get in our own way as well. Doc, did you have your hand up? Oh, I thought I saw your hand up. Part of our trial that we'll overcome is keeping our tongue under control. We'll spend a whole class talking about that. And so this is my question. What effect might the things we say have on those we're trying to influence? Do the things we say influence other people? So I want you to put yourself in these shoes. You're trying to teach the gospel to somebody, whoever that somebody may be. Do you think they listen to the things you say? Do they listen to the things you say aside from when you're teaching the gospel? Do they listen to you totally? And so remember, as we talked at the beginning, the why. The why being, my brethren, if anyone among you strays from the truth and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the errors of the way will save his soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. What effect might the things we say have on the why? And so, do we all make mistakes, say things that we shouldn't, do things that we shouldn't? Yes, we do. But here's the thing. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? So discussing trials and discussing our faith that works leads to this next theme that we'll see. Wisdom of God versus wisdom of the world. And so we might consider Solomon when we talk about wisdom, right? Why would we think Solomon when we talk about wisdom? Okay, he was known for his wisdom, right? He was known for his wisdom. And so we might think that. But James discusses this. And so the context he discusses is wisdom from above versus wisdom of the world. James chapter 3 and verse 17 says, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. So when we get to that particular chapter, That's part of what we're going to break down in the lesson. We're going to talk about how wisdom from above is pure, and then how it's peaceable, and how it's gentle and reasonable and full of mercy, and all those things. But there's a big difference between the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of the world. So, in your own mind, what is the difference between the wisdom of God and the wisdom of the world? The wisdom of the world says what?
Our worldly wisdom, it's defied. It has chinks in it. It's not perfect. God's wisdom is perfection. Because he said it, he is giving us what we need to uplift ourselves from the world to something better. Never into his ultimate perfection, but in completing us to what his expectations are. So, we who are human have a long road to hoe, I guess.
Do we, as humans, categorize things in our lives in terms of what's important? Do you look at your life and say, well, it's important for me to do this and this and this, and then this other thing's not quite so important, and so I'll do that later, or maybe not even get to it? We all do that, right? We all do that. That's the wisdom of the world, where we decide what's here or there. Miss Laverne?
We also categorize sin. We think this sin is worse than that sin, but God says a sin is a sin.
God says a sin's a sin. That's true. That's true. And so in our mind, we may say it's a little sin, right? Oh, a white lie. At least I didn't go, on a rampage and murder somebody. And so sin is what? What is sin? If you were to define sin? Transgression for God. And what does it do? Which one? The white lie or the murder? All of them, right? And so we'll talk about those things. And so, but he goes on to make points in James. He goes on and says things to avoid: riches, different relationships, and how these things play a huge role in determining where we're going to end up eventually. And so here's the question that I ask in the notes. It says, how do we gain the wisdom of God? What's that? Reading the Bible. Asking for it. That's big, right? How important is prayer? And so I'm glad you brought that up, Jeannie. How important is prayer? We just did a whole class on this, right? It's huge, right? It's huge. And so when we think about asking for it, and I'm glad you said that, because I'm going to actually, I like to add stuff to my notes. Hold on, let me add this, because I didn't have that in my notes. I think that is a huge thing for us to think about. Does God hear us? Does God hear us? Yes. And if you ask for his wisdom, now here's the thing. When you ask for his wisdom, how does he give it to you? Okay, through his word. Through experiences. Are the experience, let me ask you this, Megan, are the experiences that you get that help you gain wisdom, are they always pleasant? Most of the time not, right? And so that goes back to one of those other themes that we saw, or that we're going to talk about in James, is trials, right? Trials. Can you gain wisdom from trials? Most definitely, right? Where do you gain more wisdom? Through trials, or when everything is going peachy? Trials, right? Trials. And so we're going to talk about how we gain that. But Miss Laverne makes a good point as well. You have to be in the Word. You have to be in the Word. Is that a Sunday, Wednesday kind of thing? Sure, you should read the Word on Sunday and Wednesday, right? When else should you read the Word? Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday? Yes. Yes, yes, and yes. And now, you don't have to raise your hand. I'll raise my own hand if you're like me. How many of you read something and you're like, I have no idea what I just read? And then so what do? Yeah, read it again, and then go look and meditate on it. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about being in God's Word, not just to read through and then, okay, I read it and now I don't remember any of it, Miss Laverne.
Sometimes you can read something and you don't understand it, so you go and look up on what the different preachers say about it, and you read that, and you also read what unspiritual preachers say
Right.
about it, and that helps you understand.
Yeah. And so when I was putting together the James class, and so we were talking about, Lynn and I were talking about this morning, how I like to put together my own classes. I mean, it's okay to use a book. I don't have a problem with using a book. But for me, I gain a lot more when I sit there and type, 60 pages worth of stuff, because it challenges me. And then so I'll read this, and then I'll read, maybe a commentary, maybe I'll pull up a Bible dictionary or whatever. And I've got all these things going on, a million things going on at one time. Now, I perfectly can understand where everything is and what's going on. You might look and say, I don't even know what you're talking about when I'm sitting there typing. But this is how you gain wisdom, right? It's through just the reading, but the study and the reflection and the experiences and all those things that happen. And so you put them all together into one big ball, and then you gain wisdom from them. And so what we're looking to gain and what we're looking to talk about in this book is gaining the wisdom of God instead of just the wisdom of the world. And that's huge for us to consider as we go forward here. One of the other themes that he'll talk about is this: live in the world, but not of the world. Well, what's he talking about? John, what would you say, Davila? What would you say if I were to say, all right, this is what your job is. Your job is to live in the world, but not be of the world. How would you describe what your job is?
Well, don't be what the world does.
Okay.
But live in it, but don't be like it is.
Okay. Don't be like it is. Glenn?
There are religious groups who separate themselves from the world, and they create, a community or something of like-minded people, and they live in harmony, but they have no influence because they don't interact with other people. And I think that's part of what we have to do. The idea of letting your light shine is you're around other people who do not believe what we believe. Hopefully, it starts conversation, it starts comments or questions about why do we do what you're doing.
Influence. That's big. That's a big word, Miss Laverne.
I always thought that communities or communities that separate themselves from the world is not living in the world.
You're right. You're right. So the people that separate themselves into these little communities, that they're not really living in the world. And so we think about the things that we'll discuss here in James. And I come back always to what I call the central theme, the faith that works. How do you allow your faith to work, and how do you become the influence that Glenn was talking about if you have zero contact with anybody outside the walls here? It's really hard, right? It'd be really tough for us to make that. And so, Jack?
Yeah, something you said earlier, and I hadn't thought about it before. Anyway, when you're sitting around talking to friends or co-workers or whatever, and you're talking to somebody that's not a believer, and they'll kind of put you off, or so then they go tell somebody else, oh, you don't want to talk to him, he's a religious fanatic. But that person might see what he's about.
Right.
So you interacted,
Yeah.
not with the initial person, but with somebody else.
Yeah. Can you be an example to people and teach them the gospel? Can people look at your lives and say, there's something missing in my life. I don't have X, Y, Z. I don't have what Shane has, because, and then maybe somebody come to you and say, why can you be so happy, or why can you be so content with everything else that's going on in your life? And what a door that opens for you, right? What a door that opens. And so we'll see this over and over in this book how we can step right through that door when it opens. And I think it's huge. Yes.
I was gonna say this, very hard discussion. When I see that live in the world and not the other world, I would ask the question. Maybe not question, but comment. Be it Daniel was told, look, you gotta live in the situation you're in, but you don't have to be talking about in it all. And I think that's where the spiritual part of us overcomes.
Right. It's about, and so I like the correlation that we can make between Daniel and James. Because the book that I taught the kids back there right before we taught James, guess what it was? It was Daniel. It was Daniel. And so you make these correlations between these and you bring these things out. And I think it's huge for us to consider. One of the things that we'll also see is having fellowship with God and not fellowship with people and things of the world. So there's a difference here, a fine difference between what we see living in the world but not of the world, and then having fellowship with God and not fellowship with the world. And I think we've kind of described that as we've gone on, because some of you have said things like, well, yes, you have to live in the world, but you're not doing, what was that you said, John? You're not doing those worldly things that the other people are doing. And so that's what we're talking about, Glenn.
I think at the same time, we've got to have selective fellowship.
Right.
If we're going to influence people, we have to interact. We have to
Right.
be somebody that they know they can count on, that they can talk to.
Yeah.
But then when we pull back and do not participate in things, it does help promote that. Hey, Larry, we're friends. Why are you not okay with this?
Right. You never know, and so this is the thing that I like to say over and over. You never know which door is going to open, right? You never know who is it going to be that might have an interest in the gospel. You never know who or when your opportunity might come for you to teach something to someone or say something positive to someone or be an example to someone. And so because you don't know that, then you keep going. And then so the ending, and we'll come back to the ending here at the ending, what we talked about at the beginning, is the last verses. And I want to read these one more time for us, because as we go forward, I want this to be your thought. And so what I would suggest to you is, before you maybe read through some of the material before the next week, read James chapter 5, 19 and 20. Each week, read those verses and understand the why. My brethren, if any among you strays from the truth, and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns the sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. Helping our brothers and sisters is huge. How do you do that? Well, what we'll see is you go through trials, you gain wisdom, you help your brethren with the wisdom that you've gained. You take that faith that you have and you put it to work. You don't just talk about helping someone, you actually do what? You do it. We're going to talk about how gaining that wisdom of God can help other people as you talk to them and you teach them. We're going to talk about being an example, not to just those that are outside of this room, but also to individuals that are here with us together. And then as we do that and we gain fellowship with God, we're going to do everything we can to bring everybody else with us. And I think it's just huge for us. And this book is so practical and so important for us to look at. I'm so looking forward to the rest of this quarter for us to go through the study. So next week, Lord willing, next Sunday morning, we'll tackle James chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. James chapter 1, 1 through 18. If you have the handout material, a few pages over, Mark even numbered these pages. Man, that's awesome. Page 7 are the questions for the class for next week. So if you get a chance, go through those questions, read James chapter 1, 1 through 18, and then we'll discuss that in detail next week. Thank you all for your participation.